Chapter 4. From Brain Activity to Consciousness. Quote, Consciousness reigns, but doesn't govern. Paul Valéry. We may now provide a plausible account of how consciousness arose in evolution and appeared during individual development in certain species. The evidence suggests that consciousness is entailed by reentrant activity among cortical areas in the thalamus and by the cortex interacting with itself and with subcortical structures. The theory proposes that primary consciousness appeared at a time in evolution when the thalamocortical system was greatly enlarged, accompanied by an increase in the number of specific thalamic nuclei and by enlargement of the cerebral cortex. A starting point for these evolutionary events was probably the transitions from reptiles to birds and separately to mammals about 250 million years ago. An animal that evolved with a degenerate reentrant set of circuits linking many cortical regions together could make enormous numbers of discriminations and distinctions. For example, it could link numerous sensory signals together, make many perceptual categorizations, and connect them in various combinations to memory. In this view, primary consciousness emerges from reentrant activity linking perceptual categorization to value category memory. The pattern of integrative activity in this thalamocortical reentrant neuronal network, called the dynamic core, would create a scene in the remembered present of primary consciousness, a scene with which the animal could lay plans. Clearly, inasmuch as it can make these plans, such a conscious animal would have an adaptive advantage over animals lacking similarly enhanced discriminatory capabilities. The memory system in such a conscious animal is influenced by value systems and by selected synaptic changes brought about by previous categorical experience. This memory system is likely to be mediated by more anterior cortical regions such as the frontal and parietal cortex, whereas ongoing perception is likely to be enabled by more posterior cortical regions. Consciousness is a process that consists of an enormous variety of so-called qualia, the discriminations entailed by the widely distributed and highly dynamic activity of the thalamocortical core. In such activity, the brain speaks largely to itself. I must stress that it is the interaction of the various systems in the core that is critical. We must therefore be careful to avoid assigning consciousness to a specific region. The understanding that it is the selectional reentrant activity of groups of neurons in the core that yields phenomenal consciousness makes it unnecessary to invoke dualism. Even though consciousness is a process without causal powers itself, it is faithfully entailed by the complex activities and causal powers of the neuronal groups that make up the reentrant core. Moreover, from very early developmental times, signals from the body to the brain and from the brain to itself lay the grounds for the emergence of a self. That self, like consciousness, is also a process. It relies on conscious experience for reference to its own memories, and that conscious experience enhances communication with other individuals of its species. Of course, in the case of primary consciousness, awareness and conscious planning are limited to the remembered present. An animal with primary consciousness lacks an explicit narrative concept of the past, cannot extensively plan a scenario for a distant future, and has no nameable social self. For these traits to appear, another evolutionary event had to occur, again involving reentrant connections. At some time in high primate evolution, a new set of reciprocal pathways was developed, making reentrant connections become conceptual maps of the brain and those areas capable of symbolic or semantic reference. We know that symbolic tokens can be mastered by training chimpanzees, and thus chimpanzees with some semantic capabilities may possess the glimmerings of higher order consciousness. But higher order consciousness had to await its full flowering during the human evolution when true language appeared. At that point, consciousness of consciousness became possible. Reference could be made to a lexicon, the tokens of which could be linked through syntax. Rich concepts of the past, of the future, and of a social self emerged. Consciousness was no longer limited to the remembered present. consciousness of consciousness became possible. According to neural Darwinism, re-entry in the enormously complex dynamic core distributed to the thalamus and across the cortex was the key integrative event that led to the emergence of conscious experience. That experience reflected the enormous power of discrimination made possible by different complex core states. These states necessarily involve integration of multiple aspects of a unitary scene. New core states and unitary scenes differentiate in time and develop as a result of myriad signals from the brain itself, the body, and the world. In considering this picture, we must not forget that much of behavior is determined by non-conscious interactions among subcortical parts of the brain and the cerebral cortex. Many of these non-conscious responses underlying habits and learned behavior had to be established previously, however, by conscious distinctions mediated by the core. Interactions among core systems, non-conscious memory systems, and signals from value systems operate together to account for the richness of human behavior. A brief summary of the discussion so far may serve to focus the view of consciousness I am taking here. Conscious states are unitary but change serially over time. They have wide-ranging contents and access. Their range is modulated by attention, and although in large measure they show intentionality, they are about objects or events. They do not exhaust the domains of which they refer. Above all, they entail subjective feelings or qualia. My thesis is that the evolution of a reentrant thalamocortical system capable of giving rise to the dynamic core allowed the integration of vastly increased complexes of sensorimotor inputs. Animals having such a core were therefore capable of refined discriminations. Qualia are just those discriminations, each entailed by a different core state. In brief, conscious states reflect the integration of neural states in the core. With this picture in mind, we can clear up a number of logical errors or semantic inconsistencies that have plagued studies of consciousness. One such error is that the failure to distinguish physical causation from logical entailment. Proposals that the action of the thalamocortical core causes consciousness confronts a difficulty. Since causes precede effects, these proposals imply the existence of a temporal lag between incommensurable processes. Instead, neural action in the core entails consciousness, just as the spectrum of the hemoglobin in your blood is entailed by the quantum mechanical structure of that molecule. Another set of errors is related to this issue of causality. Philosophers have put forth the notion of a zombie, a creature lacking all consciousness but able to behave in all respects as if it were conscious. Possibly this misguided idea originated from observing the behavior of humans with so-called psychomotor seizures, who can carry out complex acts without conscious awareness. But such act sequences were first learned consciously. In the midst of such a seizure, a person cannot learn a new task, a task that, like most, requires consciousness for its acquisition. The failure of logic involved in positing a zombie may be revealed by positing a hemoglobin zombie. Imagine a zombie with all of your bodily structures and functions, but with blood cells carrying hemoglobin that is white instead of red, and yet, even though white, binds oxygen identically to yours. Not likely. An additional set of confusions may arise because of the reification as things of properties and processes. Consciousness is not a thing, it is a process. The question, do qualia exist, carries the burden of a similar error. A further error is contained in the assertion that the sensory categories such as color and various other perceptions exist in the world independent of mind and language. Speaking of mind, one often hears of the assumption that a dynamic, self-organizing system like the brain must possess some constant component or essence, or contrariwise, some sharp temporal or spatial boundaries in order to answer the question, am I the same self as I was before? Continuity does not imply essence, nor is it necessary that a system be constant to maintain a resemblance to previous states. It has often been maintained that if a structure or property exists, it must have a function. This is not necessarily true. What, for example, is the function of dreams? Sigmund Freud made an extensive argument for the function of wish fulfillment. but it may simply be that dreams are entailed as a particular state of consciousness when there is a blockade of both input and output in the thalamocortical system during rapid eye movement, sleep, a sleep period rich in dreams. Perhaps the most flagrant breach of logic is the claim that, to explain a phenomenon, one must necessarily replicate it. If you insist on this absolutely, you can never explain consciousness, history, flying, or hurricanes. There are certain processes, however, that must be experienced subjectively before they can be explained. Consciousness is one of them. It is necessarily private because it is entailed by the reentrant core activity in the individual brain. With some of the underbrush cleared away, we can now explore certain features of brain activity that affect how we obtain knowledge with the goal of providing grounds for a brain-based epistemology. To do so will require us briefly to explore various approaches to how knowledge is obtained and assessed. Chapter 5, Epistemology and its Discontents. Quote, doubt everything or believe everything, these are two equally convenient strategies. With either we dispense with the need for reflection. End quote. Henri Poincaré. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy concerned with the nature, scope, and origins of knowledge. In brief, it is the theory of knowledge. As such, it has occupied a central role in the development of philosophical thought. But any foray into its branches will reveal a very broad spread of opinions about the validity of ideas in the field, and even severe doubts as to the usefulness of their pursuit within philosophy itself. A quick look into epistemological compendia will reveal how the term itself has been subject to modifiers. Feminist epistemology, virtue epistemology, traditional epistemology, naturalized epistemology, and even the death of epistemology. I have no intention of plumbing the depths of this contentious field, but inasmuch as my aim in this book is to connect brain science with human knowledge, I have to do some more brush clearing. It will turn out that, looked at from a scientific standpoint, the theory of knowledge is far from complete. To put the enterprise into perspective, I shall briefly review some central issues, ending with issues related to brain-based epistemology. Traditional epistemology is concerned with knowledge as justified true belief. Much of the philosophical debate about this concern turns around the meaning of the terms knowledge, true, and belief. In that respect, it can be considered to be a language game as described by Ludwig Wittgenstein, who had his doubts about the whole enterprise. The central concern of traditional epistemologists goes back at least as far as Plato's essentialist ideas. In modern times, it can be traced to René Descartes' notions of the solitary thinker searching for beliefs that cannot be doubted. His central notion, cogito ergo sum, was of course the origin of dualism, a metaphysical position that most modern scientists reject. He was centrally concerned with the removal of doubt, with establishing a secure foundation of knowledge. The foundationalist position stemming from the Cartesian view is to some extent the starting point for concerns of traditional epistemologists with the formal nature of mental operations. Their position is also concerned with the normative aspects of the subject as so construed. How can we justify or validate true belief? The entire position of traditional epistemology turns around arguments related to the thinking, subjects, and the separate world the subject must confront. It is no surprise, then, that debates have occurred among rationalists who emphasize innate mental operations, empiricists who claim the knowledge is achieved mainly from sense data upon interaction with the world, and Kantians who approach the issue by connecting a priori with a posteriori ideas. Claiming that none of these views reflects the interaction of humans with the world in which they act, a number of thinkers have rejected the entire enterprise. These views may be seen in the essays of Richard Rorty and Charles Taylor, both of whom can reasonably be classified as belonging to the death of epistemology school. A central claim of these proponents is that we are not detached observers of the world operating through representations in our mind. Instead, we are agents embedded in the world, gaining our knowledge through the action in the world. Moreover, our brains are embodied, and that embodiment is essential to any construal of how those brains work to obtain knowledge. I will not elaborate further on traditional epistemology or the thoughts of its detractors. Their efforts are armchair operations, whatever the correctness of some of their views. Instead, it may be more fruitful to consider efforts to relate epistemology to the scientific enterprise, to naturalize it. As I have already discussed, a key example is provided by Queen's proposal to naturalize epistemology. His original proposal was that epistemology is concerned with the foundations of science. Aware of the failure of foundationalism, he proposed that we consider the psychological processes that lead to beliefs about the world. Queen suggests that the relation to the physical domain should include physics as well as the sensory receptors of the human subject. He suggests that this allows us to maintain the extensional purity of physics. The subject receives controlled output, certain patterns of radiation, and delivers as output a description of the three-dimensional external world and its history. The relation between the meager input and the torrential output is a relation we are prompted to study in order to see how evidence relates to theory. Effectively, this proposal casts epistemological issues in casual terms, but in limiting the field of interest to the world, the skin, and various sensory sheets, the proposal avoids explicit consideration of transformations that occur within the human subject: consciousness, intentionality, memory, all subjects that I have discussed in previous chapters. I will consider later how this breach can be repaired. At this point, it is illuminating to take another effort to psychologize epistemology, that of Jean Piaget. Piaget, at a time before Queen's proposal, addressed himself to what he called genetic epistemology. By this he meant the attempt to explain knowledge, quote, and in particular scientific knowledge on the basis of its history, its sociogenesis, and especially the psychological origins of the options and operations upon which it is based, end quote. Unlike Queen, Piaget actually conducted a program of empirical research, one mainly focused on child development. He proposed that there were patterns of physical and mental events, cognitive structures, underlying intelligence, which appeared at the particular stages of development. According to Piaget, there are 4 stages: the sensoromotor, 0 to 2 years, the pre-operational, 3 to 7 years, the concrete operational, 8 to 11 years, and the stage of formal operations, 12 to 15 years. In the sensoromotor stage, one sees intelligence in the form of motor actions. In the pre-operational stage, one sees the onset of intuition. In the concrete stage, there is logic, but only in terms of concrete reference. And in the formal operational stage, one sees the emergence of abstractions. Piaget stressed several processes of adaptation: assimilation, the interpretation of events in terms of existing cognitive structures, and accommodation, the alteration of cognitive structures to relate to the environment. In a series of ingenious experiments and observations on children over half a century of effort, Piaget sought to show how knowledge is built up. He challenged the position of traditional epistemology as too static, as neglecting the development of knowledge. He also criticized the emphasis of traditionalists on validity and justification that rested on the views of an isolated observer. Instead, he claimed that by following the development of the sciences, we can discover the value and norms that regulate those sciences and the knowledge derived from them. There is little doubt that Piaget was a great pioneer. There are, however, a number of difficulties in his proposals. The first is related to his notion of the strict sequence of stages. Child psychologists have broadly verified many of Piaget's observations, but have challenged his somewhat rigid and speculative framework. Instead, the term genetic epistemology is potentially confusing. His studies might more aptly be described as ontogenetic epistemology. Regardless of terminology, there is a major weakness in the underpinnings of Piaget's biology. For a good part of his long career, he tended, like Freud, to rely on the discredited biogenetic law of Ernst Heinrich Haeckel. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Of more concern is his rejection of neo-Darwinism, which in some degree may have been related to his belief in recapitulation. In addition, Piaget insisted on a dubious connection between the sequences in the psychogenesis of the developing human individual and the historical emergence of scientific ideas. It was overreacting to suggest that the historical development of Western science recapitulates the stages of individual human development. Despite those idiosyncratic proposals and his tendency to overreach, Piaget's empirical efforts had an immense influence on our notions of mental development. Among the more recent attempts to base a naturalized epistemology on psychology, we may note the work of Michael A. Bishop and J.D. Trout. These authors have put forth perhaps the most extensive, indeed scathing, critique of what they call standard analytic epistemology, what I have called traditional epistemology. In its place, they propose a program to promote excellence in reasoning. Pointing out the fragility of these reasoning processes in many sectors, they propose a program of pragmatic, reason-guiding prescriptions to help us to reason better than any alternative program, set of traditional epistemology. To identify successful reasoning strategies, they suggest an epistemological theory called strategic reliabilism. This consists of assembling robustly reliable rules, calculating the costs and benefits of a given strategy, and applying judgments about the significance of a problem, the weight of objective reasons for devoting resources to that problem. This program replaces the notion of justification in traditional epistemology with pragmatic, rule-based tests of practical success in reasoning. As such, it is normative. If a given psychologically based reasoning strategy yields superior outcomes, it should be adopted. Note that this prescriptive suggestion is based on scientific assessment of real-world outcomes. The normative aspect of this set of proposals should not be conflated with an illicit crossing of the is-ought divide. I have eschewed that crossing for ethics and aesthetics, for in those cases, scientifically based criteria and data are largely lacking. The norms of strategic reliabilism are supposed to be adopted only if appropriate reasoning results in accessible outcomes. The psychologically based enterprise I have briefly summarized here is an exercise in empirically based and naturalized epistemology. It shows much promise, but it does not undertake to consider the neural constraints on behavior that we are concerned with here. It is worth pointing out that the two approaches complement each other. We would like to base epistemology on scientifically certifiable outcomes, but we would also like to assess the relevance or irrelevance of the neural underpinnings of these outcomes. At this point, a brief mention of two other scientifically based fields may be in order. The first, named Evolutionary Epistemology by Donald Campbell, has two main branches. The first is concerned with how Darwinian selection constrains the means of knowledge acquisition in a given species. This branch of study overlaps the work of anthropologists in efforts to complete Darwin's program. The second, more dubious branch of evolutionary epistemology is concerned with the wholesale application of selectionist thinking to knowledge itself. An often cited early example is Karl Popper's notion that scientific thought is grounded largely on a series of conjectures subject to selection by attempts at refutation. Another example is Richard Dawkins' proposal that ideas are propagated as memes that, like genes, can replicate, be inherited, or be selected against. This last notion has emerged in the field called evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology is a somewhat more cautious application of E.O. Wilson's sociobiology to patterns of behavior. Wilson's original sociobiological proposals to explain behavior as altruism as a result of gene action was sharply criticized. Nonetheless, evolutionary psychology continued to put an emphasis on genes as the prime units of selection, selfish genes in Dawkins' designation, in order to explain behavior, particularly social behavior. In both evolutionary epistemology and evolutionary psychology, a kind of pansectionalism is used to explain knowledge and behavior. In sporadic cases, the concepts of these fields have some value, but both are attempts to reduce behavior and knowledge to one overarching paradigm. This runs the risk of generating just so stories that are difficult to verify. Logic and propositional analysis are not simply products of evolution, and certainly not of selection in present-day individuals or populations. Moreover, genes are not, in general, the units of selection during evolution. Individuals are. If Piaget overstepped his bounds in rejecting Darwinian evolution, practitioners in these two fields have over-applied selectionalism in their efforts to explain complex entities. Nonetheless, at the level of brain function, selectionism remains a valued approach, one that provides the ground for constructing a brain-based epistemology. Chapter 6. A Brain-Based Approach. Quote, "Your theory is crazy, but it is not crazy enough to be true." End quote. Niels Bohr. We can now ask this question. Can we develop a brain-based epistemology that can begin to deal with the issues raised in the previous chapter? As I have stressed, such an effort must go beyond Queen and deal with the physical basis of mentation and consciousness. It must also be broadly consistent with the developmental emergence first studied by Piaget. As I have attempted to show in previous chapters, the extended theory of neuronal group selection and the analysis of the neural basis of conscious experience are attempts to fulfill these requirements. Here I want to consider further the relation of these matters to the strengths and limitations of a brain-based epistemology. Queen and Piaget both regarded epistemology as a branch of psychology, not neuroscience. We may ask whether the deficiencies of their proposals may be repaired by our understanding of how the brain works. What can a brain-based epistemology contribute to the picture of how we acquire knowledge? Such an epistemology must be based on evolution, that is, natural selection. This is fundamental, but it must not be mistaken for the assumptions underlying the field of evolutionary epistemology that I mentioned above. It simply refers to the fact that all of the brain mechanisms we have discussed arose through the evolution of Homo sapiens. This may seem trivially obvious, but it has some profound implications. One is that the brain, as a fundamental structure for elaboration of knowledge, was not designed for knowledge. Evolution is powerful and opportunistic, but it is neither intelligent nor instructionistic. We can agree with the critics of traditional epistemology that there is no detached Cartesian observer. Instead, the evolutionary assumption just made necessarily requires that the brain and body are embedded in the environment, or eco-niche. And as we shall see, once language emerged in human evolution, our knowledge and its development, as well as our evolutionary path, depended on culture. As Peter J. Richardson and Robert Boyd point out, culture is not equitable directly to the environment or eco-niche. I shall return later to this issue. I have already suggested that the human brain is a selectional system, not an instructional one. The brain of Homo sapiens evolved to its present size very rapidly, increasing by a factor of 3 in size from Australopithecus some 3.5 million years ago to present-day humans. The largest contribution to this increase was made by the growth of the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that is essential for judgment and planning. The evolution of reentrant connectivity provided vertebrate, mammalian, and finally human brains with the most important organizing principle for the acquisition of knowledge. Inasmuch as a large portion of brain development is stochastic and epigenetic, that is strongly influenced by the fact that neurons that fire together wire together, no two brains, even those of twins, are identical. Thus, in analyzing the structure and function of the human brain, detailed history must be taken into account, first during evolution and then during individual brain development. The epigenetic and historical changes in the formation of brain maps are strongly affected by the signals from the body and the environment. This is true during fetal development as well as the development after birth. For example, the proprioceptive system of a late human fetus will distinguish self-generated movements from those imposed from outside. After birth and during infant growth, enormous selectional changes will occur in the synaptic populations of the central nervous system. These changes reach high points in the critical periods of development. In such periods, we find, for example, changes in the first few years when signals from the two eyes lead to ocular dominance columns, structures responding to input from either the left or right eye, thus allowing stereoscopic vision. Later on, as adolescence approaches, the ability to learn multiple languages, previously facile, appears to diminish. Both of these changes are accompanied by vast alterations in the distributions and strengths of synaptic connections. Indeed, even after the major outlines of adult neuroanatomy are established, the borders of cortical maps can change dynamically depending on the input from the body and the environment. The somatosensory maps of the cerebral cortex mediating touch are a classic example. Increased input from the receptors of specific fingers will not only result in expansion of the cortical somatosensory areas responding to input from these fingers, but also cause boundaries to shift for the whole hand. Thus, for example, the cortical maps responding to the left-hand inputs of violinists are greatly expanded. This dynamic yet historical view of brain development is in accord with the theory of neuronal group selection. I have reviewed it briefly here to emphasize the plastic nature of brain development, which may be considered never to stop until we die. Not only is the fine structure of each brain unique, but the principles of neural Darwinism lead directly to the notion of degeneracy. Different brain structures can carry out the same function or lead to the same output. What do these observations imply for epistemological concerns? First, the historical, epigenetic, and degenerate features of the vastly complex human brain depend on bodily and environmental inputs, and above all, on action. In the original formulation of the theory of neuronal group selection, it was pointed out that the perceptual categorization itself depended on so-called global mappings. These are complex structures composed of both sensory and motor inputs and outputs. The theory states that the sensory and motor systems are both necessary to develop perceptual categories. Second, the notion of re-entry as essential for brain development and function puts the emphasis not just on action, but also on interaction of brain areas. In a selectional brain, memory, imaging, and thought itself all depend on the brain speaking to itself by re-entry. Third, by applying the principles of neural Darwinism, we may resolve the mystification surrounding consciousness and thus extend the ground of naturalized epistemology. Consciousness appeared in vertebrate evolution when reentrant connections in the thalamocortical system arose to link anterior memory systems dealing with value to the more posterior cortical systems devoted to perception. The result was an enormous increase in discriminatory power resulting from myriad integrations among the reentrant circuits comprising this dynamic core. Qualia entailed by these neuronal interactions are those various discriminations. Animals equipped with such dynamic discriminatory brain structures had an obvious advantage, particularly for the planning of adaptive responses in food gathering, mating, and defense. Fourth, being selectional systems, brains operate prima facie not by logic, but rather by pattern recognition. This process is not precise, as is logic and mathematics. Instead, it trades off specificity and precision if necessary to increase its range. It is likely, for example, that early human thought proceeded by metaphor, which, even with the late acquisition of precise means such as logic and mathematical thought, continues to be a major source of imagination and creativity in adult life. The metaphorical capacity of linking disparate entities derives from the associative properties of a reentrant degenerate system. Metaphors have remarkably rich elusive power, but unlike certain other tropes such as simile, can neither be proved nor disproved. They are nonetheless a powerful starting point for thoughts that must be refined by other means such as logic. Their properties are certainly consistent with the operation of a pattern-forming selectional brain. Not only is each such brain unique, but the sensory input from the environment and the motor output of the animal is never identical on separate occasions. This excludes a strict machine model of the brain and mind. It requires that memory be a dynamic, recategorical system property, not a fixed storage of all the variants of a scene, say of a familiar room visited on multiple occasions. One more essential issue stems from the fact that selectional brains necessarily must operate under constraints imposed by value systems. These are evolutionarily inherited structures in the brain that establish salience, punishment, and reward. As we have already discussed, value systems consist largely of diffusing ascending neural networks that modulate synaptic responses by releasing specific neuromodulators or transmitters in a broadside fashion. One example is the system in the basal ganglia in the brainstem that releases dopamine. Release of dopamine during training is critical to the anticipation of rewarding acts. Although value systems of this kind are essential, they only constrain actions in perceptual categorization. Value is not category. Categorization must be achieved through each individual's behavior. The connection of these notions to issues of emotion and its effect on knowledge is more or less direct. Traditional epistemology rarely, if ever, concerns itself directly with issues such as emotion, except perhaps obliquely in dealing with normative aspects of justification. In contrast, in brain-based epistemology, the mechanism proposed for consciousness by the theory of neuronal group selection is universal. It applies to all discriminatory responses, whether they involve perception, imagery, memory, feeling, and emotion, or even mathematical calculation. In many cases, these processes interact. Brain action cannot be considered, at least at its outset, as a detached process of machine-like calculation in the absence of emotion. If this picture of principles underlying brain-based epistemology is correct, then early formulations of thought are by nature associatively rich but relatively imprecise. How then do we come to form more precise concepts necessary for scientific pursuits? What about logic and mathematics, both of which involve precision that is essential for enlarging our knowledge and understanding? Any attempt to answer these questions must confront the issue of language. This is certainly the case for traditional epistemology, which deals largely in propositional or sentential terms. It is also an unavoidable issue in considering the actual development of knowledge and concepts during human history. I have already discussed the onset of higher order consciousness and its acceleration over the emergence of syntax and a lexicon. The capacity to develop concepts of the past and future and to acquire a social self depends very strongly on the acquisition of language. We are the only species with a syntax-based language. Many scholars have suggested that language is a biologically evolved trait, and some have even proposed that we possess a specific language acquisition device that we inherit to allow us to carry out and recognize syntactically correct statements. The theory of neuronal group selection rejects this view. It is surely the case that certain brain regions, as well as bodily structures such as the vocal cords and the space above the vocal cords, evolved to enhance production and recognition of vocal sounds. It is also evident that the portions of the brain known as the basal ganglia were already able to help the cortex regulate and recognize sequences of motor acts. The interaction of basal ganglia with the motor, sensory, and prefrontal areas of the cortex may have led to a generalized capability of detecting sensor-motor sequences, a kind of basal syntax. Were that the case, a syntax-based true language may have arisen as an invention based on these already evolved capabilities. Whatever the case, the possession of language, with its enabling effects on cultural transmission, obviously led to an enormous expansion of conceptual power. Although the linguistic expansion and associative powers of metaphor can lead to poetry and imagination, language also makes possible the development of logic. Logic may have its origins in brain events related to the persistence and disappearance of objects, to the development of operant conditioning, and to the learned consequences of motor acts. In sentential terms, it also allows naturalized epistemologists like Quinn to define truth by logician Alfred Tarski's notion of disquotation. Quote, "Snow is white," is true if and only if snow is white. When logic is developed in its most refined form, it is most general. The true inferences from sentences characteristic of first-order predicate logic are independent of lexical substitution. The case of mathematics and its relation to language is even more challenging than that of logic. Is language necessary for arithmetic to be developed? The position that is necessary is known as the strong Whorfian view, after the linguist Benjamin Whorf. There is empirical evidence that preverbal infants and nonverbal primates have the ability to deal precisely with sets containing with 1 to 4 members. Moreover, studies of the indigenous Munduruku people in Brazil have revealed that the language lacks words for numbers beyond 5. Although these Indians fail in counting and precise arithmetic beyond the number 5, they can compare and add large collections of objects. These findings appear to exclude the strong Whorfian hypothesis, for this ability to carry out numerical approximation occurs in the absence of linguistic tokens. It has been suggested that this capability may require that the activity in humans of neurons in the parietal cortex, specifically those in the intraparietal sulci, shallow fissures separating folds of the parietal cortex, Although this proposal has been challenged, neurons tuned to numerical quantity have been found in the prefrontal and parietal cortices of macaque monkeys. The results suggest that although language is perhaps not essential for the beginnings of arithmetic, it plays a role in the further emergence of exact counting and arithmetic during child development. Although the Munduruku do not carry out counting, Western children at around age 3 suddenly appreciate that each counting word refers to a precise quantity. Thus, one might opt for a weak Orphean hypothesis, although this too has been challenged and further analysis will be necessary. The great German mathematician Leopold Kronecker once said, quote, "The natural numbers are the only numbers that assuredly exist. They are given to us by the Almighty. Everything else is the work of man." End quote. Perhaps given what we are beginning to understand, the initial gift was limited to the numbers 3 or 4. Does a picture emerge from our brief review of various approaches to the theory of knowledge? What we have seen so far is the thought precedes language, but once language sets in, an explosion of possible thoughts occur. And there is a temptation to equate thoughts and beliefs, and even sometimes knowledge, to propositions and propositions alone. Traditional epistemology has yielded to that temptation. In its search to validate true belief, it indulges in a language game. Its goal is lofty and ambitious, but is based on a narrow set of assumptions about the means by which we think and interact in the world. Its models, which are based either on Cartesian foundationalism, implying a dissociated receiver of instruction or information, or alternatively on a Kantian mixture of a priori and a posteriori ideas, do not seem to correspond to the facts. In proceeding without reference to scientific knowledge and experiment, traditional epistemology ignores how knowledge actually develops. Quinn's suggestion to naturalize epistemology addresses this issue. By limiting its extent to surface receptors in physics, however, it excludes the direct consideration of intentionality, the notion that consciousness is generally about objects, even inexistent ones. But intentionality is a critical aspect of how we acquire knowledge. The analysis of consciousness by the extended theory of neuronal group selection proposes expanding the naturalized view to account not only for intentionality, but for the relation between physical causation and conscious experience. By considering value systems that have evolved to constrain selectional systems such as the brain, this theory can also relate emotional experience to knowledge. If a brain-based epistemology seems a sound way to proceed, what does it recognize and how much can it claim? Brain-based epistemology takes account for the heterogeneous sources of knowledge. It recognizes the primacy of natural selection but does not attempt to explain behavior solely in evolutionary terms. Instead, it emphasizes the epigenetic origins of brain structure and dynamics. In this view, brain development depends on action in the world, and as a consequence, each brain is unique. Pattern recognition by the brain precedes logic, and early thought is creative in its pattern making through processes akin to metaphor. These processes are not free of feeling. Indeed, the constraints of value systems essential to the evolution of adaptive behavior make emotional experience a necessary accompaniment to the acquisition of knowledge even after logic and formal analysis supervene at later stages. This position helps us to understand the origin of perceptual categorization of concepts and of thoughts based on interactions between the brain, the body, and the world. It gives a deeper understanding of such processes as imagery and memory, which are essential to the acquisition of knowledge. Finally, by providing a testable model of consciousness, it clarifies the relationship between physics and conscious thought. In ranging beyond the narrow bounds of traditional epistemology, brain-based epistemology must take account of insights provided by an analysis of illusions, confabulations, and neuropsychological disorders, all of which lead to distortions of knowledge. Advances in neuroscience promise to shed some light on these areas, which are considered in later chapters. As powerful as brain science is, however, it is subject to limits. Its detailed exploration of how the brain works remains at its early stage. Furthermore, our understanding of how language is enabled by the brain is in its infancy. Language, arguably the most powerful vehicle for the elaboration of knowledge, both enhances and complicates matters. I hazard a surmise. Even if we could accurately record and analyze the activity of millions of brain neurons as an individual formulates a sentence, we could not precisely specify the contents of that sentence by reference to neural recording alone. The idea that we might develop a cerebroscope capable of doing so is confuted by the complexity, degeneracy, and unique historical causal path of each brain. Nonetheless, through neuroscientific research, we will certainly be able to develop important generalizations about how we acquire knowledge. There is another limit to the straightforward application of brain-based epistemology, one that relates to normative issues in various cultures. We must avoid the naturalistic fallacy and concede that ought does not derive from is. To nature, we add products of our second nature. A fully reductive scientific explanation of that nature and its ethics and aesthetics is not desirable, likely, or forthcoming. Cultural factors play a large role in determining beliefs, desires, and intentions. As Richardson and Boyd have pointed out, human evolution is accompanied by the coevolution of culture, which provides a relatively rapid and powerful means of change affecting the basis of knowledge, feeling, and behavior. Last, we must recognize that there are different kinds of truth. Science is concerned with verifiable truth. Mathematical truth rests on formal proof and tautology. Queen defines logical truths as a sentence set from which we get only truth when we substitute other sentences for its simple sentences. Historical truths are harder to establish, depending as they do on unique events and complex situations. The tests of such truths are multiple, but as in the case for science, they may be validated, if that is at all possible, by predictions, or as T.H. Huxley pointed out, by a process of retrospective prophecy. The analysis of clues similar to that made famous by the inferential feats of Sherlock Holmes. So how does epistemology stand with all its discontents? To consider it dead appears to me to be excessive, yet even if we accept that empirical science offers it a sanctuary, we must admit that our knowledge of knowledge has great gaps. Even if we agree that a scientific basis for epistemology is a more rewarding path, we must currently settle for a mixture of approaches. This is a humbler and more lenient position than the traditional one, but I suggest that it is more fruitful and revisable. With this as background, we must examine certain serious splits that have occurred in the forms of human knowledge and consider how they may be repaired. Chapter 7, Forms of Knowledge. The Divorce Between Science and the Humanities. Quote, "Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing wonder and awe, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me." Immanuel Kant. Our discussion of brain-based epistemology recognized that there are various forms of truth and different criteria for the validation of each form. In addition to the verifiable truth reached through scientific investigation, there is logical and mathematical truth, and there is truth as established in the writing of history and in law courts. There have been many philosophical approaches to deal with the forms of truth, ranging from notions of the synthetic a priori to deep analyses of induction, deduction, and mathematical proof. The position I have taken is that the naturalization of epistemology must account not only for scientific truth, but also for the biological origins in human thought and consciousness of the various other forms of truth. At this point, I want to deal with a long-standing split or divorce between science and the humanities, including the so-called human sciences. After tracing some origins of this split, I will propose an approach to resolving it that is consistent with a scientifically based brain theory. But before tracing these origins, I must point out that when I use the word science, I refer specifically to Western science dating from its origins in the 20th century. Of course, scientific pursuits can be traced back to ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, and even dark periods of the Middle Ages. But the split of which I speak arose in the germ with Galileo and Descartes and was explicitly exposed by the philosophical historian Giambattista Vico in the early decades of the 18th century. The historian Isaiah Berlin traces the divorce between the sciences and the humanities to Vico. This relatively unknown figure challenged the views of Descartes and denied that the human beings possessed an unalterable essence. Humans make their own history and understand their own doings in a fashion different than that by which they understand external nature. Our knowledge acquired from inside, our second nature, differs from that which we develop from observing the outside world. Instead of the Enlightenment view, a single set of principles applied to all knowledge, Vico applied these contrary thoughts and mounted an attack on the total claims made for the new scientific method. As Berlin indicates, a great debate started, of which the end is not in sight. Vico's thoughts, which became known only much after his death in 1744, challenged the truth that there was only one set of methods for establishing the truth. From the time of Descartes and Francis Bacon through to the present, one can trace a line of thought that, contrary to Vico, holds up the idea of the unified system of sciences, natural and humane. Instead of listing all the thinkers on this article, the well-known side reflecting the Enlightenment ideal, I shall first emphasize the other stream in this debate, the one that can be traced to Vico. Then I shall contrast this view to the opposing views held by some modern proponents of reductive or unified science. A key figure is the German thinker and philosopher Wilhelm Dilthey, who regarded the understanding of human beings as an interpretive matter, one within which notions of physical causation have no place. In his work before 1900, he died in 1911, Dilthey rejected the notion that humans were essentially rational. Instead, they exercised willing, feeling, and thinking in various combinations. He assigned the disciplines of psychology, philosophy, and history as Geistwissenschaften, or the human sciences. These were to be distinguished from Naturwissenschaften, or the natural sciences, which were concerned with the physical world. In a manner not far removed from Vico's program, he asserted that descriptive psychology stood at the base of the human sciences. Later, he revised this base to include human history itself, particularly in its socio-historical context. Essentially, Dilthey's position rested on the notion of hermeneutics, the study of interpretation and its conditions by insiders within a historical culture. Many modern philosophers have pursued one aspect or another of this stream of the debate. There are, of course, other tributaries of this stream. One might include the differences between science and religion, and more recently, the science wars, in which postmodernists have suggested the extreme position that science itself has no claim to objectivity, but is merely another mode of looking at things, not superior in its truth claims to any other mode. Rather than pursue these parts of the debate in detail, I wish to make one suggestion that must be considered if the various views on either side are to be reconciled. It seems to me that if Descartes' dualism is maintained, there must necessarily be a split, the human sciences on the side of res cogitans, thinking things, and the natural sciences on the side of res existens, extended things. This may seem curious because Descartes thought to ground all knowledge starting with his res cogitatas. Indeed, Vico rejected Descartes' position. Clearly, the position on consciousness I have already exposed rejects Cartesian dualism. In one interpretation, we might claim that William James also rejected a substance dualism in denying that consciousness was an entity or a thing, suggesting instead that it was a process whose function is knowing. The strains and dilemmas that have emerged from the split have driven thinkers to extreme positions as well as to penetrating observations. The philosopher Alfred North Whitehead was deeply concerned with the issue and indeed constructed a whole metaphysics, the philosophy of the organism, to get around it. Later, the debate flared up when C.P. Snow wrote that there were two cultures or polar groups, literary intellectuals versus scientists. Without indulging in such extremity, the physicist Erwin Schrödinger pointed out that the curious facts that the great theories of physics did not contain or address sensation or perception, but simply assumed them. On the side of science, extreme postures have adopted with as much energy as those expressed by historians and hermeneuticists. For example, schools of psychology derived from John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner put forth the notion of behaviorism, that all mentalistic explanations should be rejected. Some, like Skinner, admitted of mental events but denied mentalistic causes. In the past decade, a view called eliminative materialism has surfaced that actually claims that there are no mental events or processes. Another philosophical school of thought, logical positivism, proposed in effect that science was the only legitimate form of knowledge. It was logical in its dependence on logical and mathematical studies, and it asserted that a priori knowledge of necessary truths could be made consistent with empirical science. Essentially, the claim was that any statements made outside this frame were neither true nor false, but meaningless. Unfortunately, there was no way of showing that the assumptions of this school of thought could themselves meet the criteria of meaningfulness. Some of the thinkers emerging from the so-called Vienna Circle, which provided an early impetus to logical positivism, hoped to formulate a completely unified science. The hope of Otto Neurath, for example, was to give sociology a solid scientific status, but he never achieved the dream. Nonetheless, some of his views were cousin to Quinn's later notion of naturalized epistemology. Two other efforts at scientific reductionism have come to the fore in recent years. The most ambitious is one derived from theoretical physics, the hope of constructing a so-called theory of everything. This is the search for a coherent, formal description, essentially mathematical, that would unify all the four forces of nature: electromagnetism, the weak force, the strong force, and gravity. Some claims have been made that with string theory, we are well on the way to achieving this goal. Unfortunately, there is presently no single verifiable form of such a theory, and in any event, it certainly would not, in Schrödinger's sense, include an explanation of the sensation and perception necessary to understand it. Another extreme of scientific reductionism based on biology rather than physics has been put forth by E.O. Wilson. He claims that once we understand the so-called epigenetic rules by which the brain is formed and works, we will be able to reconcile human behavior, including normative behavior, by applying these rules. Thus, Wilson claims that even ethics and aesthetics will yield to this reductive analysis, which he calls consilience. The term consilience was adopted by Wilson from William Whewell, who used it in his tract The Philosophy of Inductive Sciences in 1840. By this term, Whitewell meant that jumping together of facts and theory across disciplines to create a common ground of explanation. Wilson's statement early on is, quote, "Given that human action comprises events of physical causation, why would the social sciences and the humanities be impervious to consilience with the natural sciences? Nothing fundamental separates the course of human history from the course of physical history, whether in the stars or in organic diversity. The extremism of this position and of those on the other side speaks to the need for moderation and a different form of reconciliation, to which I now turn. In the course of that effort, I will expand on some of the claims that I have skirted briefly in the above account."